Hi.
Hello there.
Hello.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, Andrea. Hi, Craig. Hi, everyone. Nice
Good
to
evening.
meet you all.
Can hear you all very well.
Pleasure to meet you again. Yeah, everything is good. Everything is good. Okay, so I see everyone is connected in terms of speakers. How is it going to play out with the participants? I don't know, Kathleen, are you there with us? Are they going to join at 1 or we have already everyone? Hi, Doreen. Morning.
Morning, Marcos. Well, just to check in, this is Carrie. It's already live streaming, so I don't know if that was the intent. So whatever you discuss, just keep in mind it's already live streaming.
Okay, good.
I don't know if Kathleen is there. I'm not seeing her.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks, Carrie Ann. So then we maybe give another 3-4 minutes for the other participant to join, and then we can start at the time that was planned for. Okay, I think it's just 1 p.m. So we have a session in front of us. So I think we could start. And I been given the task to run this initial part of the seminar or the webinar. And let me introduce myself. First of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. So my name is Marco Ubiso from the ITU. And I really wanted to welcome to all of you to the launch of the launch event of the second edition of the guide to developing national cybersecurity strategies, or NCS in short. Just to let's say provide a little let's say to share a little information here. This is a result. The guide is actually a result of around 18 months of hard work undertaken collaboratively by 20 institutions of different nature, from intergovernmental organization into academia, into private sector, into think tank. And I'm very proud, and I think I can speak on behalf of all the partners. We are very proud to share today the outcomes really of this, I would say, fantastic co-creation and co-design experience. So before maybe going into a little bit of the substance of how we are getting organized and how we're going to run together the webinars, just a couple of usual indication on use of Zoom. So please check that your microphone is muted if you're not talking. Use the chat to raise questions related to the specific topic, and this will help us to moderate this large meeting. You might also use the chat platform to make any possible comments or any questions, or raise any views you might want to have. And then the different moderators of the different session will monitor the audience input throughout all the discussion. Also, we were going to have a few polls at the beginning and at the end of the panel, so be ready to let's say participate and engage actively on that. Now, let me go back into a little bit more a substantial topic of the webinar. And I now got the webinar will be recorded. So let me share how we have structured the discussion today at the webinar. So as mentioned, we are basically kind of formally launching the second edition of the guide. And for that, we have actually developed a website where the link to the guide has been uploaded. Now, the URL is NCS Guide, so National Cybersecurity Strategy acronym, ncsguide.org. And as we speak, I think that the link to the guide is there. And maybe someone from the ITU, a colleague, can also post this into the chat so everyone can see that. Thanks, Oran. Good. So that is where is the link of the new version of the guide. So apart from this formal launch that is basically happening because we just uploaded the document into the website, we're going to engage in 4 different panels to discuss on various aspects related to the national strategies, to share experiences that the different stakeholders had in actually rolling out programs of assistance on the ground, and also to see how the guide, which again, it was a very, very terrific collaborative effort, can support, can assist, and can help countries in their journey in actually having developed, established, and roll out a national cybersecurity strategy. So there will be 4 panels throughout the whole period, throughout the whole duration of the webinar. But in order to start the discussion, we also have present here, my boss, but also a director of the elected official from the ITU, a director of the Telecommunication Development Bureau, Dorit Botman-Martin, which offered, also her time to basically help us into this endeavor and to maybe provide a few words as opening. And then I'll take back and then we'll carry on with the discussion. Doreen, please.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you, Marco. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you for this launch of the second edition of our guide to developing a national cybersecurity strategy. Over the past 2 decades, people worldwide have benefited enormously from the growth and the adoption of digital technologies, and of course, the many opportunities that they bring. But while digital transformation is this uniquely powerful enabler of inclusive and sustainable development, it is vital that the underlying infrastructure and services can be safe, can be secure, and also, of course, can be resilient. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has served to illustrate why. And of course, over the past 18 months, we have witnessed a surge in cyber incidents, in malicious misinformation campaigns, and targeted cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, including hospitals. With digital becoming the new normal, we need to act now to reinforce our cyber protection and of course to guard against bad actors. And that means that every country needs to put in place a comprehensive national cybersecurity strategy. The UN Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation, and of course the recently launched UN Common Agenda report that was launched back in September, emphasizes the importance of trust, the importance of security, and of course the importance of stability in fostering universal digital inclusion. But developing an effective cybersecurity strategy can be a complex task. So to help governments, back in 2018, a first working group was set up of partner organizations to jointly develop and publish the first guide to developing a national cybersecurity strategy, or NCS. And since then, the number of strategies has increased significantly. When we launched the first guide, only 76 countries had a national cybersecurity strategy. And today, some 127 now have in place a national cybersecurity strategy. And of course, many of them actually used our NCS guide as a key reference, which is terrific. So that's great progress, but of course, gaps remain. And I think that's why we're here today. Especially in low-income countries where we estimate that 60% of least developed countries still do not have an NCS in place. So we do need to put our collective expertise to work to help these countries and to help every nation to protect their populations and their digital resources. The fast-changing nature of cyberspace, and of course our increased dependency on ICTs and the proliferation of digital risks all call for continuous adjustments to every country's cybersecurity posture. And that's why the second edition of our NCS guide could not come at a more critical time. And with the first edition, as with the first edition, I am confident that this new guide will serve as an invaluable reference tool for policymakers, for regulators, and actually for every stakeholder that has an interest in building a safe and robust digital environment. The new edition of this guide, like its predecessor, as Marco was just noting, is the result of what I think is a unique collaborative effort that involved more than 20 specialist organizations from the public and the private sector, as well as academia and civil society, who worked with us to share their experience, their knowledge, and of course, their expertise. And I do want to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to them for their invaluable support and also for their commitment to making this project not just a great achievement on its own, but also an outstanding example of successful multi-stakeholder collaboration in the service of a safer, resilient, and inclusive world. Marco, back over to you.
Thanks a lot, Doreen. And this was really something that I think you emphasized a lot. And we never be tired to emphasize on the fact that this is really a unique effort. I mean, we started this journey back in, I think, 5 years ago, in starting gathering together with different institutions, with different organizations for the first edition. The journey was difficult sometimes, but then we managed to pull out, a common and a co-created, completely co-author product. That was the first version. And when we moved to the second iteration, we got actually much more interested than before, and then that basically generated this other fantastic experience that we had. And the webinar today is really reflecting this kind of a multi-stakeholder nature approach that we have. And that's why we didn't want to just launch the guide as, just putting the guide out, but just also having a conversation around, the different experiences from the different stakeholders that I had during the production, during the development, also, how the guide is going to be used on the ground, which is from us, of course, the most important element, how we can really help countries to accompany them into the journey of having a more solid cybersecurity at the national level. So I think it is pretty clear the direction we are going, and we have here all the different representatives from the different institutions, which in a certain way became friends, and we are working with them on a regular basis. And I'm really, really happy to see, very much friendly faces all over the place here. So let's carry on, and let's maybe start with the first conversation that we are going to have. Now, as I said, each panel will be moderated by a different person, which is again part of the community, and we can actually kick off the discussion. Before doing that, I also wanted to provide another little piece of gratitude and a big thanks to the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, which has been also helping us a lot throughout the process. I know that most of the organizations here are actually part of this community, and we also, as ITU, we were investing a lot of our time and resources. In fact, we are kind of one of the founders, in a sense, on this big endeavor. And they always have been supporting us in our work. So I think, and also of course, this panel today was, of course, facilitated and organized by the GFC. So I think it's important also to recognize again, as part of a collaborative effort, what GFC has done for us. So thanks a lot. Okay, so having said that, let's go with the first panel. And I think the first panel is actually moderated by Jan, which is online. Jan, are you there with us?
I am indeed.
There you
go. Good morning,
Hi,
good
Jan.
afternoon.
Good morning. So pass the floor to you. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for those introductory remarks. I am Ian Wallace. I am a senior advisor in the Office of the Coordinator for Cyber Issues at the US State Department, but today I'm actually wearing my other hat as chair of the Policy and Strategy Working Group of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. And we're the working group within the GFC that focuses on national strategies, among other things. So we're going to get into talking to a fantastic set of panelists, but as Marco noted, throughout today, we're going to have a series of polls. So I'd like to ask my colleague Kathleen if she'd put up the poll, and you'll see the first of 3 quick questions there. So if you'd like to choose one of those answers. Okay, I'm beginning to see the answers coming in. Give it a few more seconds. Okay, while you're looking at that, I'm just going to quickly introduce our panelists. We have 4 panelists today. Andrea Rigoni, who is a partner leading cybersecurity work in the government and public services practice at Deloitte, which is a global consulting firm. We have Melissa Hathaway, who's a senior fellow and member of the Board of Regents at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, which is a think tank based in Washington, DC. We have Bernadette Lewis, who is the Secretary General of the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization. And we have Craig Jones, who is Director of Cybercrime at Interpol. So we're going to come to those shortly, but first of all, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And as you will see, we have, in your opinion, the main benefit of adopting a national cybersecurity strategy is to help a clear whole of government and whole of society approach to achieve a stronger cybersecurity posture. I'm wrong. The efficient management of cybersecurity risks, just snuck ahead on the first one. Second question seems to be a fairly healthy consensus that the biggest challenge is in understanding the threats, and that's something we're definitely going to come and talk about in the panel ahead. And on the third question, the cyber threat landscape is rapidly evolving. What's the most concerning trend? The sophistication and number of malicious actors, and that's something I think we'll pick up on in the course of this conversation. So, conscious of time, then let us dive right into the conversation. So I'm going to begin our conversation by asking some questions of each of the panelists, and then at the end, if we have time, we will take some questions from the chat. So as we're going forward, if you have a question, please feel free to write it into the chat. But we're going to begin by going to Andrea. And Andrea, the question that I'd like to come to you with is very simple. Why should countries create their own national cybersecurity strategies? And conscious of why we're here, why is a guide like this useful to countries in developing those strategies?
So, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great question, to start with. It's the essence of the work that some of us started 5 years ago, as Marco mentioned. So I'm proudly one, not the only one, but one of the supporters, of this initiative. Why it is important? Before answering that, I think we need to understand that countries and therefore, governments of, all countries are heavily involved in the digitalization of, their economy and society, either through strategies. I mean, there are countries that are actively promoting the adoption of, digital everywhere, or there are simply countries that are doing nothing, but they are, facing by the citizens, by the business, and heavy usage of digital technologies. It's a literal explosion of digital services in every sector, not only of economy but also society. This created the perfect environment also for a serious development over 3 decades of any kind of threats. We refer to them as cyber threats, but they're not anymore just cyber, are just threats, traditional and cyber and digital, that thanks to this new environment, they have been, further enabled. Not only for this reason, cyber has also become a main concern for national security, because the threat actors, being single criminals, being companies that are using anti-competitive measures, being other states, are combining, traditional and digital and cyber approaches, to get an advantage. If this is the situation, and if this is the situation, the protection of a country has become an incredibly complex task. The targets to be protected are not just the government assets. We're talking about protecting the entire country or the entire digital ecosystem that most of the times is not just in the country, but it's also, outside. And it includes companies, organizations, and last but not least, the citizens. So a solid protection of a country or supporting the development of a country cannot be achieved without the active participation and coordination of all the actors I mentioned. The majority of them being sitting outside the government, sometimes are directly regulated. We can think about telcos, we can think about banks. Others are at the beginning of a regulation journey or not regulated at all, if not, through very generic regulations on, capital markets, data protection, etc., etc. This is the reason, this complexity of the ecosystem and the rapid pace of economic, socio-economic, and digital development on one side and threats on the other are creating, these requirements of having a strategy. Strategy is not a document. It can be represented through a document, but at the end is the list of objectives and tools and the approach and guiding principles that a government will use to play such a difficult role in their national and international ecosystem. Because, protecting a country today, forgetting about the international dimension would be almost impossible. So this orchestration role is relevant, and that's the reason why strategy is not just a declaration of objectives, but it is a precise identification of tools and measures and how to use them. There's not the right or the wrong decision. Is a constant balance that in the past was a balance that you had to reevaluate every few years. Now it's a reevaluation that you almost have to do daily between adding more policies and more controls, or closing the borders or the digital borders, paying the price of limiting the business, or just opening the borders, giving no rules because you want to support the digital development. On the other side, exposing yourself to risks. As you can understand, if these are the tensions, there's no right answer. Is a constant balance that the government not only has to identify, but has also to promote at national and international level, to be effective. Just one closing remark, to answer your question. That means that I've seen the polls, and there was a question at the beginning. I think the audience is already aware that there is no right answer. It's maybe all of them. One important ingredient, if you agree with what I said, is culture and experience. This job is becoming extremely difficult. Yes, it's a matter of having a lot of experts, having the capacity, but here is about a strong and clear, leadership. That's extremely, extremely difficult. Thank you.
Andrea, thank you very much. And I think that reminder that national cyber strategies are more than just documents, I think is absolutely essential part of this discussion. Will serve as well as we go forward. Andrea also touched upon the fact that although security is key to thinking about these national strategies, increasingly we're being reminded that these strategies are fundamental to a country's economic development. And this is a relatively unexplored aspect, I think, of the issue. But one person who's been thinking quite heavily about this is Melissa Hathaway, who is our next panelist. And so, Melissa, for the next sort of 5 or 6 minutes, perhaps you could give us a little bit of an insight into the work you've been doing about the intersection between cybersecurity and economic development, and why a guide like this can be useful in supporting countries' economic as well as security priorities.
Great. Well, thank you, Ian. It's a pleasure to be here representing the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies and my colleague, Francesca Spidliari, who did an awful lot of work on both the first guide and the second guide as original placeholders of working on both. It's really interesting, you know, the digital transformation is really being brought to every single country around the world and being promoted through the Sustainable Development Goals, where each of the SDGs have a digital component. The development community for just in 1 year is spending about $170 billion in digital development. But the United Nations has estimated that we really need $1 trillion to be spent in the digital development of all and every one of our countries. Our countries are becoming more dependent upon this innovation being embedded into critical infrastructures and services in order to advance, whether it's education, modernize our overall industries and advance our digital economies. And so the digital economy and the economic growth and well-being of our countries has become really the forefront, and the framework for the National Cyber Guide is really about introducing resilience and thinking about the protection of these investments, this digitization, and ensuring that they'll be secure and resilient and lead to the outcomes that we want over time. So so I think this is inextricably linked, the digital economy and the digitization and the aspirations that our countries have. And so within the guide, we start to talk about how important it is to identify the priorities for that digital economy. What makes the country strong? What's driving its GDP? And the importance of that digital strategy, the digital agenda, the industrial policies, the research and development, the export-import strategies, and that overall thinking of what companies represent the top 2% of their GDP. What are the most important critical infrastructures and assets? So if I were just kind of give you sort of, when you look at a particular country, and I'll just choose Indonesia, you know, it's sort of their gross domestic product is already 1 trillion GDP. They're the largest economy in Southeast Asia. They're a G20 member. They have a very large archipelago, like over 17,000 islands with 9 major seaports. So when you start to think about key thing for their economy is seaports. Their key sectors are services and industry, which is manufacturing and mining and agriculture. So those are their top industries that have to be protected. Jakarta is the fintech hub in the region. So fintech is important. So when you start to look at just in Indonesia or any country, you begin to start to say, these are the most important things to my economy. And therefore I need to start to tailor my cybersecurity or my strategies to ensure those things are resilient. Now, the Secretary General of the UN, Gutierrez, talks about the dark side of innovation. And we are seeing the dark side of innovation appear all over the world. And it's coming up in cybercrime and surveillance, disinformation, digital authoritarianism, exploitation of data, and the facilitation of espionage. And these are starting to become some of the threats to our digital economy and to our society that our cybersecurity strategies and our national strategies are beginning to address. When you have Colonial Pipeline, oil and gas knocked offline in the United States from a ransomware, or the power grid in Johannesburg in South Africa knocked offline, or Iran's rail system knocked offline, or Maersk shipping around the world knocked offline. These have real economic consequences to our governments and to society. And that's why we need to have these cybersecurity strategies married up with our national strategies and the digital economic strategies of these countries. So I think that this is really important. The changing threat landscape and the increased dependency on ICTs, the proliferation of our digital risks call for us to continually improve our strategic thinking on these areas and investments in these areas. There are too many countries who are not investing enough in their digital resilience. They're taking for granted that the ICTs will just work and not have an underpinning threat. But it's really exciting to see that 127 countries have adopted the NCS type of framework and moved forward with their strategies since we last published the NCS guide in 3 years ago. And I look forward to working with my colleagues here and with countries around the world and helping them think through why they need to invest more in the resilience of their digital economy, which is underpinned with cybersecurity at its core. Thank you, Ian. I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Melissa. And as we look at the sort of security and economic dimensions of these strategies coming together, we're reminded that the digital divide, the global digital divide, is reflected in the way in which we see cybersecurity strategies, as Doreen Bogdan-Martin mentioned at the beginning. By some estimates, 60% of the least income countries have national cybersecurity strategies. One of the organizations that's working with lower income countries in particular to change that is the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization. Their Secretary General, Bernadette Lewis, is with us. So Bernadette, how can a strategy guide like this help countries that either lack strategies or are relatively early in the strategy development process to catch up with other countries to get strategies that meet their requirements in this increasingly digital age? I'm looking and I'm wondering if Bernadette heard me, and it is possible that she didn't. So
yeah,
there we are.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Great. I'm sorry. I thought I was unmuted. Anyway, let me just get going. The poll would have already pointed to some of the challenges that developing countries face. And I'm very happy that the wrong perceptions about the level of threat, that is diminishing, but there is still a need for greater degrees of understanding that developing countries are not regarded as being, as being immune or are not a sufficiently lucrative target for criminal activity in cyberspace. So there is a continuous need for awareness creation through education and information. I think it was also mentioned that the lack of expertise and know-how, just the rapid pace, and the speakers going before have spoken to it, the rapid pace of technological innovation, it represents a challenge for understanding the evolving nature of the threats. And the developing countries often lack the expertise, and I'm saying technical, the policy, the regulatory, the legislative expertise and know-how for developing a cogent response for addressing cybersecurity issues on a national basis. And in the smallest countries, including small island developing states, this lack of expertise can be significant. And we see the whole issue of the brain drain being a contributor to the dearth of the lack of expertise. And then there's this issue of the fragmentation of responsibilities for ICT. The responsibilities may lie in different government ministries or agencies, and there may be a challenge in developing a rigorous, not just whole of government, but whole of society, a holistic approach that comprehensively addresses the national cybersecurity landscape and leadership. Leadership is important. We need a champion at the highest level of government to really drive this process. The lack of data, who is collecting? Is it the relevant data being collected to enable you to develop a strategy? And then poor investment choices. Governments, for political reasons, may be reluctant to invest in addressing a risk which may not be manifestly visible to the public. as a clear and present danger, but they would rather invest in the obvious, very visible national issues, such as, potable water and housing and infrastructure. But that there must be that recognition that broadband and ICTs must be part of that infrastructure that you're laying out. And having said that, from the CTO's perspective, we are very happy to be involved in this. This guide represents a collective wisdom, as we've heard, from about 20 organizations intimately involved in this space. And the guide, it addresses the issues of fragmentation by discussing the leadership and government issues for developing a national cybersecurity strategy. And it provides a sense of who should be involved. It addresses the human and financial resources that are absolutely necessary for developing the strategy. And it also provides guidance on the whole issue of data collection and analysis. And then the guide provides a step-by-step process for developing this national cybersecurity strategy, stressing the need for multi-stakeholder engagement and collaborative approaches. And what I love best about the strategy, and it is a significant departure from many other strategies that remain strategies and are never implemented, this guide takes into consideration the process to the logical conclusion of implementation. So it deals with implementation, the action plan, the activities surrounding monitoring and evaluation. And as our first speaker said, this is not going to be sort of a one and done exercise. It is an exercise of continuous evaluation, assessing, coming up to speed with what is currently happening in the space and adjusting. But the implementation is very important. And from the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization's point of view, we are supporting our members in their digital transformation program. And therefore, this guide is so important because whatever they do in their digital transformation program, it has to be embedded or inextricably linked to their cybersecurity program. So with that, I'm going to end, and I look forward to the rest of the discourse and discussion. Thank you.
Bernadette, thank you very much. Just before I introduce our final speaker, I would like to say that we may have just a few minutes to take questions from the chat. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the chat where I can see them. But Bernadette mentioned there that any strategy needs to be responsive to the threat environment. And our final speaker, Craig Jones, is the Director of Cybercrime at Interpol, and a perfect person to give us a little bit more of an insight into that threat environment. So Craig, if you could both give us a little bit of an insight in the 5 or 6 minutes we have for you into the threat landscape, and also perhaps take the opportunity to hear your thoughts on what are the priorities and how the strategy reflects that.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for giving me the opportunity, and also for Interpol to be involved in this piece of work, which is fundamental going forward. And Bernadette, you're making the points there about implementing and actually doing. This is very much from the Interpol perspective, is we have a global cybercrime strategy. We've turned it into a program. We have a number of projects, and these sort of documents underpin our work. We now have 195 member countries. So I worked out on the figures that were given early on. There's 68 countries here that do not have strategies effectively at this moment in time. So if I take in two parts, the threat, and then we'll look at some of the priority side of this, and I'll put that against the sort of Interpol knowledge that we have, the understanding of the threat, and then looking at the priorities and picking out the sort of policing side and cybercrime side of that. Well, as we see, this is the most prevalent, fastest growing form of transnational crime faced by countries. During the pandemic, we saw the exponential rise in the online usage for digitalization, but also that came with vulnerabilities. And within those vulnerabilities, the criminals took advantage. Their tactics, their techniques, their procedures didn't change realistically. They took advantage of those vulnerabilities. So we looked at the normal things such as ransomware. We saw an explosion in that in certain countries, but we saw that was targeting the governments and also some of that critical national infrastructure. We saw in Ireland recently Conti ransomware taking out the Irish health care service there, but there was the real world impact because people had their appointments cancelled. They had their chemotherapy treatments cancelled because they couldn't get onto the systems. And again, that's when it has that real world impact. We then looked at a business email compromise and we see the sort of the financial side of that. Now that could be called high volume, low impact because sometimes the impact is not that great. But when you look at some of the money that's going through this, we're talking in the billions globally. So that is a very, very big impact there. We're looking at criminals being adaptive. We're looking at the barriers now to commit cybercrime are lowered. Things that would only be used to be used by other actors, shall we say, the criminals are now able to pick those up online for $10, $15, $20 and start committing crime globally. So the far-reaching nature of this, the borderless of this, we need those national strategies, first of all, to give us that understanding and that baseline, but looking overall at how they develop the strategies, looking at the prevention elements of that as well. We also need to understand the threat, and we've developed a number of threat assessments recently for the ASEAN region and also in the Africa region as well. And this is about looking at some of those threats, but then turning that into how can we action against this? And we look at that through technology, process and people, but within the cybersecurity landscape. So just moving briefly then over to the cybersecurity strategy and looking at how that comes into the sort of policing side of this as well. When we look at the first part there of assessing the national cybersecurity landscape, so that's understanding that landscape in the first instance. Do we know and understand it enough? Do we identify the strengths and weaknesses within those countries? And then what actions do we then take? How do we develop that? Who leads that activity? And I've been lucky to be involved in some of this work in the UK previously at the national level. And now I'm very lucky to be leading some of this work internationally with our law enforcement partners. So again, that's looking at those vulnerabilities and that prevention side. We then need to look at that synergies and avoiding those duplications, because I see this on a global basis, but also on a national basis, where we have those duplications going on in different governments, different private sectors within the same countries as well. We look at then the cyber risk landscape. So how do we assess that cyber risk landscape? Looking at the potential impact of a cyber incident and what's the impact on our communities. The policing role is the protection of life and property and the prevention of crime. So this comes in very well with the National Cybersecurity Strategy. We look then at the response capabilities that we need. Who responds to those cyber incidents? Who takes that first response? Because in the physical sense, if it's a crime happening in a community, law enforcement does. But in the online space, it's not normally law enforcement. It might be a government agency. It might just be private sector and a first responder. So pulling together those different stakeholders and being able to get them to come together. And then that's the next one, is promoting that information sharing. Where do we share the information? How do we share the information? Sometimes, quite often, it's a one-way process or it's a no-way process. The information is not shared effectively. So again, the strategy talks about that, about how we do that information sharing, whether it's through a special arrangement, a one-off arrangement, or MOUs. There's lots of different ways we can share information, both internally on a national basis, but then how do we aggregate that data on an international level? And how do we then use that information and turn it into actionable information? And that's the doing side of this as well. We have our capability and capacity building programs. And again, that underpins the people, process and technology that I talked about before. But I think one thing we do miss out on from law enforcement side is the prioritization because of the underreporting of cybercrime. It often is not reported. If it's not reported, then it's not always a priority in the eyes of government. It then becomes a priority when you have those high scale or high impact or high media attacks. And when you have those ones, quite often then the governments take notice, and that's when they say, where's our cybersecurity strategy? Who's responsible for this? Who's taking on the activities and doing? And then looking at that, as I said, the informal cooperation in cyberspace. This cooperation we've had here is very much an informal cooperation, but look at the tremendous result this has produced, the second edition now. And this is a vital document for us to use going forward in all of our work. So just summing up then the priorities, and we look at how to deal with that global security landscape. It's information sharing, it's capability and capacity building, international cooperation. Because whilst we have a national strategy looking at the inward side of this in the countries, we've also got to turn that into an outward looking strategy as well. So within that strategy there, you need a very strong international part to that. So whether it's for law enforcement, whether it's for government sharing, again, we've got the geopolitical side to this as well, but we're not going to have time for that today. But from our side, as Interpol being a neutral organisation, we are able to be that conduit for information sharing. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I'm looking forward to seeing if we have time for questions. Ian, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're right up against time. I'm going to take one important question, I think, that we have from the chat, however, which is just to ask the panelists about the importance of a whole of government approach, something that we see in the strategy. I think Bernadette mentioned the importance of multi-stakeholder approach, is anyone, perhaps Melissa would like to comment on why a whole of government approach is so important and why that's such an important feature of this strategy?
Thank you, Ian. I do. I think that it's many times we see it's the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Telecom who has the lead. But in my own experience, having worked for 2 presidents and working with many countries around the world, it really has to be elevated at the highest level of the country. So then it could be coordinated across all of the different ministries who have responsibility either for leadership for law enforcement, leadership for critical infrastructure protection, leadership for information sharing. And then also those ministries or departments or agencies are also responsible for coordinating with their private sector counterparts. And then you start to get an all of nation approach. But only if all of the different departments and agencies or ministries who bring all of their levels of expertise are involved, then that's the only way that you bring in security and resilience into all of the core services that are driving the economics and the overall health and well-being of a country. I think my final point is that it's also very important to ensure that there is budget into the national budget that sustains these capabilities. Many times our countries think about this as just an infusion for one period of time and not thinking of this as a continual investment in the resilience and security of the country. So I think it's an all of government, all of nation, but it must be funded in order to sustain it and in order to see the positive outcomes of digitization.
Andrea, I think you said you had 30 seconds.
Yeah, I want to reinforce what Melissa just said. It's not about which is the best leader in the country. You know, of course, the higher the authority, you know, the easier it is to implement the program. But there is a role for all government functions. There's a relevant role for defense. There's a relevant role for Ministry of, you know, Economic Affairs, of course, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of the Interior, Ministry of Telecommunications. So unfortunately, we preach that, but in the majority of the countries that we are assisting, even mature countries, we always, you know, find this tension that to me translates into poor understanding of the complexity. It's not about who is leading, but is how can I play in my role, you know, my role in the national strategy. That's a different question.
Thank you very much. I would love to continue this discussion, and I know our other panelists could add to this, but I'm being told we have to wrap up in order to move on to the next conversation. So I would very much like to thank Andrea, Melissa, Bernadette, and Craig for your fantastic contributions, which I think have set up this conversation in a very helpful way. So my final act is to pass the baton to our next panel, which is going to be chaired by Georges de Mora, who is the head of industry solutions, the Center for Cybersecurity of the World Economic Forum. So George, over to you.
Thank you, Ian, and great start for this event. I thought the session was very insightful. So thank you also for all the panelists. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you today. And it's a real pleasure to moderate this panel discussion on governance, risk, and resilience, which thematic is particularly close to me because it links closely with my role at the World Economic Forum, where I collaborate with several multi-stakeholder communities to address systemic cybersecurity challenges faced by critical infrastructure industries and increase their cyber resilience. I think we're going to have a very insightful conversation, which is once again informed by the proliferation of high-profile cyber incidents. According to the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report 2021, cybersecurity failures are among the top midterm threats facing the world. They now pose a substantial risk to public safety, and it is imperative that the public and private sectors come together to build a path towards a secure digital future to ensure that society can continue to reap the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution. As we did for the previous panel, we'll be starting with a poll, and I will ask Kathleen to please launch the poll. We'll have two questions in this poll. The first question, in your view, what is the main challenge countries face in managing digital risks? And the second question is, in your opinion, what is the key area of intervention to be prioritized to improve a country's overall cybersecurity posture and resilience? Two very important questions. We'll leave 30 seconds to the audience to answer, and we'll then display the results before we start the panel discussion. So while the uptake is slightly growing, it seems that for the first question, we're just getting a clear lead with one of the responses. So we'll probably give a few more seconds for anyone else. Okay, so Kathleen, I'll let you now display the results. I think we have a good amount of responses. So for the first question on the main challenges that countries faces, at least the group coalesced mostly around policymakers have not prioritized cybersecurity risks stemming from increased reliance on ICTs and the expansion of e-services, digital systems and platforms. And for the second question regarding the key areas to be prioritized, there's almost a tie between C and D. So information sharing and cooperation, is definitely one that we hear a lot as particularly important to prioritize, and capacity building, I think we know, is paramount, and we have a growing capacity shortage and deficit that certainly has to be addressed. Thank you very much for your participation in this poll. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the wonderful panelists that will be contributing to this discussion. First, starting with Daniela Schniedrig, Head of National Engagement and Advocacy at the Global Partners Digital. Matthew Moorhead, Legal Advisor, Commonwealth Secretariat. Caroline Wisser-Harris, Lead International Operations at the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Center. Amanda Craig, Director of Cybersecurity Policy Digital Diplomacy at Microsoft. And last but not least, Serge Droz, Senior IT Security Expert at FIRST. Welcome, everyone, and thank you again for participating in this discussion. So, Matthew, I will be starting with you for the first question. In order for national cybersecurity strategies to add value to the development of a stronger and more resilient national cybersecurity posture, it is essential to elaborate a roadmap for its implementation. What considerations should be made by government leaders when developing such roadmap and the foundational building blocks that underpin it?
Thank you, George. I'm really happy to receive this question and to speak to the issue of implementation. In the guide, which we're all launching today, we identify implementation as the most important phase. However, in a sense, of course, implementation is much more than a phase. It's the primary objective of the entire project behind this excellent guide. And everyone involved in its production under the leadership of the ITU has shared an interest in producing a publication that provides practical assistance to implement real change. So I have to open by stressing that everything in the guide has been written with a view to implementation, first and foremost. And anyone who has any questions around how to implement change, I mean, the guide is for you. But to get into the specifics of your question, what should a roadmap for implementation include? The guidance on this is very helpful, I think. To emphasize again, the implementation phase is the most important element of the overall National Cybersecurity Strategy lifecycle, and a structured approach to implementation supported by adequate human and financial resources is critical to the success of the strategy and needs to be considered as part of its development. The implementation is frequently centered on an action plan, which is another word for a roadmap, of course, which guides the various activities envisioned. As with the development of the strategy, the action plan or roadmap for implementation cannot be the sole responsibility of any single body or authority. Instead, it requires engagement and coordination of a range of different stakeholders across the government, as well as support from civil society and the private sector, of course. The action plan or roadmap, developed in accordance with the principle of clear leadership, roles, and resource allocation, can support the effective implementation of the strategy. Now, the development of the roadmap is almost as important as the roadmap itself. The process orchestrated by the lead project authority should serve as a mechanism to bring the relevant stakeholders together, to agree on objectives and outcomes, as well as coordinate efforts and pool resources. The National Cybersecurity Strategy highlights the government's objectives and the outcomes they wish to realise across the different focus areas identified. In the action plan, the lead project authority should, in coordination with relevant stakeholders, identify the specific initiatives within each focus area that will help meet those objectives. Examples of such initiatives could include organising cybersecurity exercises, establishing security baselines for critical infrastructure, and setting an incident reporting framework, amongst others. The timeline and effort needed for the implementation of these initiatives should be prioritised in accordance with their criticality to ensure that limited resources are appropriately leveraged. To this end, the results and outcomes of phase 2, stock taking and analysis, specifically with regards to assessing the cyber risk landscape, might be considered. And finally, once the priority initiatives have been identified, the lead project authority should identify specific government entities as owners for each initiative. In turn, these government entities must be responsible and accountable for the implementation of each specific initiative assigned to them and be expected to coordinate their efforts with other relevant stakeholders as part of the implementation process. To ensure that these entities can deliver the expected outcomes, the lead project authority should assess whether they have been given an appropriate mandate, legal or otherwise, required for the implementation. The lead project authority should also work with the owners of the specific initiatives to understand what resources are required to accomplish the work. This assessment should incorporate human resources, expertise, and funding needs. The lead project authority should then work with the owners to help them identify and secure the required resources in accordance with relevant administrative financial structures. And the final critical element of the roadmap is the development of specific metrics and key performance indicators to assess each of the initiatives undertaken, such as whether the country conducting an awareness campaign on the importance of information sharing, organised and executed a cybersecurity exercise with critical infrastructure sector, or passed a security baseline law. Specific timelines for implementation should also be set out in the roadmap. The metrics and key KPIs should be developed by the lead project authority in partnership with the respective operators, and the latter should be encouraged to define and maintain a more detailed set of metrics to facilitate evaluations of the efficiency and effectiveness of the initiatives during and following their completion. So I could go on into more detail, but those are the key things which are needed in an effective roadmap or action plan. Thanks, George.
Thank you, Matthew. No, this is very useful, and I think for the audience, if they were to remember, some key takeaways, I think planning is essential. You have to define a clear structure with roles and responsibilities, clear governance, identify your priorities and objectives, and then execute and ensure that you have appropriate metrics to report the progress that's being made. So, thank you, Matthew, and certainly, hopefully, the guide, will be operationalized by many governments because there's a lot of useful information in there. So I would like to now shift to the policy angle of this topic. And Daniela, this next question will be for you. Policymakers have the daunting task of developing forward-looking policies that address priorities from governments, industries, and civil societies. Can you share from your perspectives, how can they strike the right balance between the diverse needs, coming from a variety of stakeholders?
Thank you, George. And so my answer is going to come from my perspective as a civil society actor. And if I had to say it in a nutshell, I think the way forward are multi-stakeholder processes, but I'm going to unpack that and try and be as brief as possible. So I'll start by saying that sometimes these competing priorities or these tensions, they can be more perceived tensions than anything else, and there can be some issues around framing. And if we dig down to exactly, why we do what we do, why do we work on cybersecurity, I think at the end of the day, our main goal is likely to have more common ground than what we expect. So, for example, we want strong cybersecurity because we want our health infrastructure to work so that people can access healthcare. We want strong cybersecurity because it's a way for citizens to express themselves and engage in public life, and we care about strong democracies. And it is true that there can be some differences in how we achieve those goals and those objectives, and it would be naive for me to deny that, but I think if we try to start the conversation with what we actually have in common and start the discussion, whether it be, for the development of an NCS or any other type of policy, really, for that matter, if we started trying to distill what those main objectives are and what is the vision that we're all working towards, I think that can start a process on the right foot. Then another important point is that compromise is also a critical element in multi-stakeholder processes. And I think that idealizing, multi-stakeholder inclusive processes as these perfect, ideal processes where everyone will achieve what they want by the end, it's not realistic. But I think it also does a disservice to multi-stakeholder processes, because what we're missing is the real value of them, which is that they lead to better policy outcomes, or they can lead to better, more informed policy outcomes. And I think that working in policy will inevitably mean that there is a need to prioritize and that there will be different ways to do something. And it is likely that there will be some outcomes that perhaps a stakeholder group is not entirely happy with. But I think this is where the commitment to inclusive policymaking comes in, because it is different to have a priority from an actor or a stakeholder group disregarded, without explanation, than to have a joint discussion where different options are explored, and then we as a group make a decision that is informed by that discussion. And by the end of that process, even if what you were expecting or pushing for is not accepted or not completely, I think that at least there will be an understanding of why, and it will mean that people are more likely to want to continue engaging because they understand why a suggestion was not taken on board and they do still believe in the process. So I think multi-stakeholder processes can bring that sense of ownership, and it will make it easier to compromise on certain aspects. And then finally, the last point that I want to make is that reaching that stage where there's understanding and there's compromise in a process requires a very, very crucial element, which is trust. So that's not something that's built overnight, but it's rather, a process, and it requires a lot of work. And in order to get there and to build that trust, we need different things, but we need engagement that is meaningful. So not just tick box exercise, but an actual commitment to inclusive processes. We need engagement that is sustained throughout time and not just at the beginning of a process and then never again until it's time, to validate a policy. So I think to summarize my point, so to address competing priorities, I think it is important to go back to basics as much as possible and try to find common ground at the beginning. And then I think multi-stakeholder processes will give us the best chance of success at trying to address those competing or different priorities that stakeholders have. And I am very excited that the guide has strong commitments to multi-stakeholder approaches to the development of strategies. And I think it's important that we continue pushing for that. But also document the case studies and examples of how this actually happens in practice so that we can encourage countries to continue, adopting the approach by showing that it can be done and that they can be successful. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Daniela. This was very insightful. Now, if I can add maybe a follow-up question on the policy topic, because we often hear that policies are often asynchronous with the realities on the ground, and they don't keep up with the pace of change. And if we actually look at what the private sector organizations are facing in terms of the threat, the risks, they're certainly not covered in a holistic manner by policies that certainly cannot be enacted quickly enough to address some of the emerging risks. Could you perhaps shed some light on what is the actual purpose of those policies and this gap that we may have between the policies and the actual risk, ultimately who owns the responsibility of addressing this gap?
Yeah, sure. So I think, it goes back to that shared vision. So why do we seek strong cybersecurity? And it's not just, for the sake of the systems themselves. It's because they actually serve a purpose, which is for, citizens and humans. So I think putting, the human-centric approach and putting individuals at the core of what we do is a good first step, because as you were saying, the threat landscape is ever evolving and it's going to change so quickly that I think, keeping that sort of as the guiding principle of what we're working towards is a good first step. And then I think, going back again to the need for these inclusive processes, I think it's important to institutionalize that collaboration as much as possible so that then we're not sort of caught off guard when there is something that's immediate, an immediate threat or an immediate danger, but actually we have a way of coming up with these policies that is collaborative and that we can ensure that we get that different input from the different stakeholders at a time where we can do that. So then when we don't have that time and the emergency comes along, then it's not it's going to be more difficult to coordinate in that moment. So I acknowledge that. So I think trying to institutionalize that as much as we can so that we can be prepared. I think that would be my 2 cents to a complex challenge, obviously. Thank you.
Very complex indeed. Thank you, Daniela. So next question is for you, Caroline, and this one links with one of the poll questions related to prioritization. So protecting critical infrastructure services from cyber threat actors has become a defining mandate for public and private sector leaders in this digital era, where digital ecosystems are increasingly interconnected and complex. From your experience, what approaches are proven to be the most effective in governing and managing these risks on critical digital assets?
Thank you very much, and thank you also to everyone who spoke before me. Just to apologize, I'm traveling, so that if there's any background noise, I'm not in my office. Yeah, so I think I'm from the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Center at the University of Oxford, and we do assessments with the CMM. And when it comes to risk assessments, that's actually a very important indicator for countries' cybersecurity capacity maturity. So we well welcomed this, or contribute to the previous guide, we contribute to this new updated guide, and risk assessments play a very important role for a country. And yeah, when it comes to tools, approaches. Sorry, I just had interference. Okay, just referring back to also to the guide. There are actually 5 activities which are quite crucial, and also in the context of the NCS development. First is to conduct a cyber threat assessment and align policies with the ever-expanding cyber threat landscape. Second is to define a risk management approach. Third is identify common methodology for managing cybersecurity risk. Fourth, develop sectoral cybersecurity risk profiles. And the fifth is establishing cybersecurity policies. All should be part of the NCS development process. And it's also something which is not a one-time exercise, but all these things also kind of have to be done during the life cycle, but also then when preparing the next NCS. Just going a little bit in detail of those 5 activities. So one is to cyber threat assessment. Daniela just mentioned how important this is, and how this also threats change all the time. So it's very important to align policies with the threat landscape. That includes, for instance, identifying, evaluating the evolving cyber threat environment, the potential impact, particular on the critical infrastructure and essential services, to identify the country's domestic critical infrastructure services. So from our experience from the assessments, we know this is often something which is often maybe a big challenge, a bigger process to identify those which are critical. Identify the specific cyber threats and risk associated with critical infrastructure and services. And in particular, those also those individuals and organizations who rely on them. The second is define a risk management approach, which should be built up on the cyber threat assessment, and also develop a national risk register. Develop a method of prioritization based on the calculation of the probability of realizing the risk and the impact, and also specify the responsibilities of key entities and entities in each sector. This is something which, I think that's what I said earlier, in terms of maturity of a country. That's something where often the gaps exist. That this is not really clear who's responsible for what, and maybe also different kind of perception who should be responsible and who's not. Third is to identify common methodology for managing cybersecurity risks that should provide guidance on assigning roles and responsibilities for various aspects of managing risks, and also provide guidance on minimizing risks through security architecture and design and regular assessment and audits. So as I said earlier, it's really an ongoing regular assessments and audits are really important. The fourth thing are the cybersecurity risk profiles, and they provide a less subjective understanding of the risks. They also should be developed for those sectors which the country has defined as being critical. As I said earlier, this also depends on the country and how they define their services and what the situation of critical infrastructure is. Also provides a business base for more specific risk assessments for individual organizations. So should be coherent across all the sectors nationally. And I think that's also something where it's really important. It's probably also sometimes a challenge. Some sectors are more experienced with doing that, or are you doing this? Some sectors for that have not done this before or not on a regular basis. And the last thing is establishing cybersecurity policies. So for the critical infrastructures, both from the government, but also operators within the private sector. And then they also describe the governance, operational and technical requirements and instruct stakeholders on the roles and responsibilities. Again, that's often something where we see that there's often some kind of gap existing. So these are some of the activities, and back to you, and I'm open for any questions.
Thank you, Caroline. This is certainly very insightful. Perhaps if I can ask a follow-up question, I think we spoke about 60+ countries that don't have a strategy today, and you know, it's possible that those countries also have limited resources. You know, what would be your recommendation to those countries in terms of the areas they should be prioritizing in the short term? You know, before they start implementing, you know, a broader strategy. You know, is there anything they can do to at least ensure that, you know, some of those low-hanging fruits are addressed and some of those, you know, common risks are being mitigated? What would be your suggestion?
Well, I guess, I mean, that's probably something there, probably some sectors which are already existing, which are probably very financial sector traditionally, or telecom sector. Building is kind of like engagement with them, connecting with them. If there's nothing existing, and that's a good way to start with, just start the conversations. But I think like a comprehensive approach, and really doing assessment of the capacities, assessment of the gaps, assessment to better understand like what is actually like the national landscape of which actors are, what sectors are there, what organizations are there, and really start this, because I don't think that's really something the short term really works. I think it's probably not a sprint but a marathon to prepare the whole country for that. So
they should read the guide and follow the recommendations, you know.
Exactly.
To be very you know,
yeah,
very exhaustive and actionable. And I think that's the particularity of these guys. It's really meant to be implemented and not just high level guidance. Thank you, Caroline. And I'm mindful that you're traveling, so we'll continue now with the discussion. And Amanda, I would like to come to you next and focus on the importance of public-private partnership. There is an expectation that governments are ultimately responsible for protecting essential services against any physical and cyber threats, yet most critical infrastructures are privately owned, and therefore the private sector plays a crucial role in safeguarding these critical functions. What models of public-private partnership can effectively govern systemic cyber risks in your view?
Thank you for the question. And indeed, you know, I think public-private partnership is really foundational to effective cybersecurity risk management, and in the context of critical infrastructure protection and more broadly. And a national cybersecurity strategy is a key document and convening mechanism by which governments can establish the importance of public-private partnership. The private sector can demonstrate an intent to constructively engage. And as you just said, there can be models for that public-private partnership that are established. So there are a few different ways in which a national cybersecurity strategy in particular can do that. You know, first, just the act of actually producing the national cybersecurity strategy can involve a consultation process that, again, just establishes a good precedent, establishes a model for consultation with stakeholders, and can really strengthen the national cybersecurity strategy guide in a way that builds partnership and makes it more effective for public-private partnership and beyond. I think Daniela said, and her comments about multi-stakeholder processes, that it's also important that they're not just a point in time exercise, but rather ongoing, involve kind of a way to engage stakeholders throughout perhaps the kind of development as well as the implementation and the evolution of strategies. And so I think beyond actually, you know, the process of producing a national cybersecurity strategy and how to engage private sector and other stakeholders in that process, establishing it again as a precedent during that process, and then extending that throughout the implementation of a national cybersecurity strategy, perhaps its evolution, is also really important. And in the National Cybersecurity Strategy Guide, there are also a number of examples of sort of places in a National Cybersecurity Strategy Guide where, again, the importance of public-private partnership can be underlined, and some potential models for that partnership can be described, so that the guide has both principles and focus areas, and public-private partnership can be encouraged in the context of both. So in the context of principles, the guide has two that are really relevant for public-private partnership. One is about establishing a vision, not only for whole of government, but also whole of society vision, which of course includes the private sector. I thought Melissa Hathaway in the last session brought up a really good point, that whole of government and whole of society approaches actually go hand in hand, as having sort of all of the government stakeholders engaged, that should be engaged, helps enable all of those government stakeholders to have the communities that they interact with engage, including various critical infrastructure organizations. So the point is just that having that vision of a whole of government, whole of society mindset as a foundational kind of principle in a national cybersecurity strategy can really facilitate coordination and cooperation across all of the relevant communities. Beyond that, another principle in the guide is, of course, that's relevant here, is inclusiveness, which explicitly again calls for a national cybersecurity strategy guide to be developed and implemented with the active participation of all relevant stakeholders. I think it's interesting how the guide acknowledges that it could be a very difficult task to meaningfully engage with all relevant stakeholders. I think this relates to the question to Daniela and what she offered in response, that it can be difficult. There are a lot of different kind of perspectives that need to be considered and worked through, but ultimately, having that process in place leads to better outcomes. Even if not all feedback is taken up, a good process with real meaningful engagement of all stakeholders can help those that are engaged understand perhaps why their feedback isn't being taken up. And that builds trust and understanding, but also creates an opportunity for those stakeholders to come up with sort of alternative ideas about approaches that might better meet shared desired outcomes. And that brings me to the final kind of point of how the guide integrates the importance of public-private partnership and its content, and that's in the focus area of critical infrastructure and essential services. The section just recognizes that the creation of a formal kind of public-private partnership can really increase the security of critical infrastructure, including by boosting trust among and between industry and government, but also by enabling sort of some of the activities that are described in that section to be more effective. So for example, the kind of establishing of effective coordinating structures for incident response, or development of cross-sector and sector-specific security baselines, having models in place where either, again, through ongoing kind of public consultation or even ideally both that and a kind of standing coordination body for either sector-specific or cross-sector discussions about some of those activities that are needed for critical infrastructure, cybersecurity risk management, from the policy side, from the operational side, can lead to better outcomes in some of those risk management activities.
Thank you, Amanda. And you touched on the fact that governments can help enforce sector-specific security baseline through various instruments. Can you share with us how effective mechanisms can be put in place to implement those common security baselines without hindering competitiveness of industries, especially as within those critical infrastructure sectors you have many small medium-sized organizations, and they're many of them in a growth mode, and this can certainly not afford the same level of investments and capabilities than the larger players. So how do we ensure that the weaker link in the digital ecosystem is still adhering to a good enough level of cybersecurity, while taking into account, their competitiveness, I would say, priorities and objectives?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question, and I think it's part of also just what a national cybersecurity strategy could set out in terms of its intention to be mindful of establishing effective sort of cybersecurity baseline requirements that are going to be really important to helping organizations manage risk effectively, but also doing so in a way that is mindful of the need for competitiveness of all organizations of various sizes. And again, I'd actually say how to do that starts with the kind of collaborative process that we just talked about in terms of a public-private partnership and ongoing ways of meaningfully engaging private sector actors in the development of things like cybersecurity baseline requirements. That kind of meaningful engagement can really ensure that baselines are constructed to be really effective at managing risk without having those kinds of potential costs or kind of tolls on the operational kind of abilities of especially small and medium-sized organizations, that can really ensure that baselines are reflective of how technology is developed, how it's operated, how it's managed by those various organizations. There may, to the point again that Danielle said, there may still be aspects of baselines that are challenging for organizations, but if there's a really good process, then there can be understanding on both sides, and some of that can be worked through, and there can be development of baseline requirements that are going to be really meaningful in terms of security and be less disruptive potentially to the operations of private sector organizations. So it starts with that collaborative process. A couple of other principles I just mentioned is really thinking about leveraging as a starting point for those cybersecurity baselines existing best practices, international standards. It's both helpful to leverage all of the good work that's been done as a starting point for just not kind of, it's quite a process to develop cybersecurity baselines, but then that also leveraging those existing sort of practices and international standards as a starting point can help promote interoperability across markets, which again really helps those private sector organizations integrate into global supply chains and be able to operate across markets with a bit more kind of consistency and interoperability of requirements. And then the final point is that the baselines themselves should also be risk-based and outcome-focused, ensure greater agility over time. I think one of the really kind of hard challenges in this space is, of course, the technology environment is continuously evolving. The risk landscape is also quite dynamic. And so there's a real need for cybersecurity baselines to be cognizant of that and to be constructed in a way that they can be agile as you have that technology environment and risk landscape sort of evolution and dynamism. So that's something that hopefully can be illuminated through the process of that public-private partnership to develop the cybersecurity baselines, how exactly they can be constructed in a manner to be outcome-focused and enable that agility over time.
Thank you, Amanda. So the key, I think, takeaway is active collaboration and consultation, between public and private sector entities, but also across government agencies to ensure better alignment between those agencies and other international agencies as well on policies and between private sector organizations that are part of your digital ecosystem. Thank you very much, Amanda. And well, I'll now be closing the panel discussion with Serge. It's often said, and I think this is a general consensus, that cyber attacks are a matter of when and not if. Focusing on prevention is not enough, and a solid cybersecurity posture needs to assume compromise and a focus on building greater response and recovery capabilities. Can you describe in a few words, what cyber resilience is actually about, Serge?
So, well, thank you for having me. I represent first the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, which really is kind of global umbrella organizations of the security teams, the first responders, the people that Craig actually said are usually on the scene before his police officers is. Now, I think one of the most important things to do if you want to be ready is to actually be ready. You need to be prepared. You cannot freelance incident response. The same way that if a fire breaks out, you cannot kind of start figuring out, okay, where's the hose, where's the fire truck, and does actually anyone have a driving license here so we can drive to the fire? That's not going to work out. You need to be prepared. I think that's kind of a given, but it's also often quite misunderstood. And I feel if the question really is what you need to be resilient, it needs to be prepared, and you need to be prepared in the right way. So if you start building up incident response capabilities, and that's the angle I'm coming from, clearly it helps to actually have a goal in mind. Why are you actually doing this? And I think that's where a national cyber strategy really comes in handy, because it should actually say what the goal of this whole exercise is. Why do you spend money on expensive technical experts, on expensive equipment? And people often don't think much about this. So what I often see is that we have new national teams that have cost a lot of money, a lot of resources, but they're really very ineffective. Why? Because they maybe spend too much money on technical expertise. If you start with all of this, you need to learn to start to walk, not run. So you can run at a later stage. What that means is maybe don't start with malware reverse engineering or all these fancy things. Start with the basics, and that's handling incidents. Now, what does it take to handle incidents? What FIRST is saying since over 30 years is what we've heard here in different colors, but essentially it means you need to have a lot of good friends who can help you. Call it multi-stakeholder approach, call it a public-private partnership. Our members are government teams, there's private sector teams, there's academic teams, and increasingly civil society teams. But at the end of the day, you need all of these around the table. I think it's very, very important that you do not consider cybersecurity as a top-down process. That's just not going to work out. The internet is not run by governments. It's also not run by a big ISP or a big tech company. Every tech company uses software or parts of technology that come from somewhere else. So you have to work together. And that really is you have to figure out what's the true multi-stakeholder approach. What is the true multi in this multi-stakeholder approach? So I find this is very, very important. And you have to make sure you really don't forget anyone. A good friend of mine, which many of you know, Christine Hoopers from Brazil, once told me when I asked her, how did you handle this when you had the soccer championship? Because this for us is a challenging event. And she said, well, we really had to make sure we had everyone on board, even kind of the small 2-person hosting company in the garage, because if their servers are hacked, they may actually attack a critical infrastructure. So think a little bit about this. It's not about having expensive forensic software or whatnot. It's about having partners that you can talk to. And that really brings me to, I think, one of the parts that really is also very highlighted in the strategy, and that's about capacity building. So capacity building is not just about technological capacity building in your own team. It's actually making sure that you have friends you can talk to. So that means they speak the same language, that in case of an emergency, you actually know what to ask these people. You may think, isn't this kind of normal? Well, let me assure you it's not. There's so many misunderstandings between culture, between different organizations. And it's important that you have these things under control, that if you call for help, you actually get an answer that makes sense. It's also important that these friends are really well distributed and they're not just kind of in your local bubble where you feel comfortable. And again, that means going out to build this capacity. It's a big challenge for FIRST. We now have members from 99 countries. Frankly, that's a little bit too little. It's not enough. We need to cover the whole planet. And for us, this is a challenge. And I think for most of us, this is a challenge. That's actually one of the reasons why FIRST really starts investing into capacity building. We are in the process of hiring community and capacity building manager, because we feel we need to bring this around the planet so we cover all of this. Because cybercrime and nation state actors, they don't really care where you come from. And if they find a white spot on the map to fill out, they'll do it. So long story short, I think it's really important for stakeholders to, first of all, get an idea of why they want to do this, and what's the broader scope, and then really make sure that they have the full team that actually knows how to play together. If you want to win a soccer championship, just having a lot of good soccer players doesn't cut it. You need to have them train and work together. And for policymakers, it means to create policies that actually are amendable to these teams working together across borders, maybe across political gaps, across trust gaps. A lot of incident responders work across trust gaps. FIRST is very proud to have all the major nations as members, even nations that aren't really very much on speaking terms. I think that's what's needed to make cyberspace secure. And I think this strategy really emphasizes this by promoting all of these values. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Serge. I think we may have time just for one question. I was looking at the group chat and I saw certainly a long thread around the ransomware threat, and I think this is quite a topical issue. So perhaps the question, for the group to just to sum up on this topic is, if governments implement this strategy, first, will they be resilient against the threat of ransomware? And if they were to perhaps prioritize some of the steps of the guide, what would be your recommendation as it relates to the ransomware threat? I don't know who would like to take this question. I'll open up to the panel.
Sure, let me jump in. I mean, ransomware indeed is something that brings us as an information security community to kind of out of our comfort zones. We don't seem to be able to tackle this, and there's several reasons. First of all, it seems to be very organized. So we're moving away from this kind of small groups of cyber criminals to something that seems to be very well organized, something we have to adapt to. And it seems to involve a political component, and just indicated by the conversations that some of our leaders are having. And again, it shows that we as incident responders and as a community, we need to stick together. And Amanda actually also talked about SMEs and small companies and organizations that are kind of left out. And I would support this. It's we very much in these conversations and in these circles focus on critical infrastructure. Ransomware is not very much a critical infrastructure issue. There was this pipeline thingy, but that was kind of an outlier. And just there's hospitals, I agree, but the hospitals were kind of like never considered IT infrastructure. There were always some other infrastructure. And I think that is exactly the point. We need to start thinking about what multi-stakeholder means. And it means these people that don't have technology at the core of its existence need to be on board, even if they're not top IT experts.
Okay. Thank you, Serge, and thank you to all panelists, Daniela, Matthew, Caroline, Amanda, and Serge again for this very insightful discussion. This now closes this panel, and I would like to now give the floor to Leslie Longstreet, Global Director, Outreach and Partner Engagement at the Cyber Readiness Institute. Thank you all.
Hi all, I'm Leslie Longstreet, the Global Director of Outreach and Partner Engagement for the Cyber Readiness Institute. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to moderate this panel today that is focused on capacity building and awareness raising, particularly because it is very in line with what the Cyber Readiness Institute focuses on, which is providing free and accessible resources for small and medium-sized enterprises globally. I know that our discussion today will be interesting and informative, but first, I believe we have a couple of poll questions. So Kathleen, if you would not mind launching those, give everyone a couple seconds to answer that. All right, we are coming up on 30 seconds. So if anybody has not answered, which I don't know if I can see that anybody has, feel free to put some answers in there. If not, we will just launch right into me introducing the panel. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and head into the panel. If there's any poll answers at the end, Kathleen, feel free to toss that into the chat. But I am pleased to introduce our panel today. I'll start with Ms. Franziska Klopfler, the project coordinator at DCAF, Kinomin Yoon, counsel at the World Bank's legal vice presidency, and Mr. Melo Thinyen, principal research fellow at the United Nations University Institute in Macau. So I think that if there's any poll results, let's see. Nope. All right. So Franziska, I will just start with you if you're okay with that. According to many definitions, capacity building is understood to be a multi-layer and multi-actor effort to create a long-lasting enabling environment. Could you provide a general overview of what national cybersecurity capacity building should include? For example, individuals, organizational and technical aspects, and how to make cyber capacity building activities sustainable and scalable.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and for that question, and thank you very much for the invitation to this panel. So I represent an organization called DCAF, the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. And this is a very interesting question, and it really relates a lot to what we discussed when we were updating the guide and working on the cybersecurity capacity building section. So I think if you talk about sustainability and the kind of this intersectoral approach to cybersecurity capacity building, of course, on the one hand, you have what Serge was just mentioning in the earlier panel, this awareness that cybersecurity is, you can never address it with just, one actor. It's really such an interlinked web of actors that all depend on each other. So that's kind of has to be at the back of your mind when you're planning cybersecurity capacity building. But I think it's also very much important to consider the general context. So, for example, if you train somebody, for example, who works in a public institution, and they come back from the training, but they can't apply their knowledge because, for example, they don't have the right tools in the place where they work, or there is not even a position in their institution where they could, really carry out their newly acquired skills. That's then obviously there's not a lot of sustainability there. As well, everybody knows this big challenge that we have in cybersecurity capacity building, where very well trained people leave for the private sector because, or for other jobs, because the institution that they work for, the salary is very low. So I think the lessons to be learned here is that it's important when you're working on cybersecurity capacity building to really be aware of this context and also address the context. So if it's whether it's a question of budget, of institutional rules that need to be addressed and changed for these people to carry out their function properly, or any other reasons that you cannot only think of this teaching a person those skills. And also what is very important in this context is to have a real knowledge of the whole situation of the cybersecurity landscape and ecosystem in general. So who does what and how do different actors work together, and that whatever training you do is ideally part of a bigger training needs plan that you have. So in the guide, we talk about this and, especially mention this importance of supporting strategic planning on cybersecurity capacity building, that there's a plan for long term and needs and how to address them through training, and the importance of the right systems being set up, of the right training that also addresses not only initial training but long term on the job training. So thank you. That's my first comment to start of our conversation. I'm looking forward to what the others have to say.
Thank you, Franziska. I really like your point about the training someone and making sure that it can apply to what they're doing or going back to, and making that sustainable. That's a really great point. I think because there was a technical error, we're going to go ahead and relaunch the poll before we dive into our next panelist. So we'll give it another 30 seconds. All right, so it looks like we have completed the poll. So I'll just run through some of the results. They seem to be moving a little bit, but if you were to develop the NCS for your country, which international stakeholders would you reach out to in order to receive support? International organizations seems to be a huge one, but also all of the above, which I would agree that all of the above, you have to consider all of your stakeholders. How would you assess the current relationship between digital capacity building and cybersecurity capacity building? It seems like digital capacity building activities have started to incorporate a cybersecurity component, but this should be further improved. Seem to be the largest answered choice. And then how can the growing cybersecurity workforce gap be addressed? Pretty evenly split throughout all of these. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for these questions, and we will dive into our next speaker, Kyung-Min Yu. Are you on here?
Yeah, I'm on here.
Okay,
Hi.
great.
Great.
So your question is for or I guess I'll just start from the beginning. The challenging of developing cybersecurity capabilities is even more pressing in developing countries where there are very limited resources to adequately address the associated digital risks. Who are the international stakeholders a country can reach out to in order to receive economic, technical assistance, and professional support?
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. It's a mouthful, right? So hi, I'm Kyung-Min Yin. I'm here representing the World Bank. So for those of you who don't know, the World Bank is a development organization tasked with ending global poverty. So we approach cybersecurity perhaps from a unique angle, that is with a economic perspective. So I will first discuss the challenges in developing countries first, and then discuss how the World Bank and other international organizations can help. So the main challenge in developing countries, as we have discussed earlier, when it comes to cybersecurity, is competition for scarce resources. Cybersecurity has to compete with things like clean water, school, healthcare, jobs, and other significant priorities. So, but then it's not that developing countries don't appreciate crime prevention or criminal justice, but rather, given the limited resources, they're in this unfortunate position where cybersecurity has to be evaluated as a utility for economic progress. And as Ms. Lewis from CTO said earlier, another issue with cybersecurity is that it's a really tough sell to the public. So the results of cybersecurity really aren't obvious or immediate, especially compared to physical buildings or clean waters or jobs, and gratification must often be delayed for long-term growth. And relatedly, perception is another issue. Cybersecurity is often viewed as a luxury rather than a necessity. And the approach in many developing countries is to resolve other issues first before dealing with cybersecurity. For instance, I had a senior law enforcement official tell me that we have real crimes where people are dying, and cybercrime can really wait. But this perception is really changing, mostly due to COVID, right? So countries are now or have been forced on this accelerating learning curve, where what was once viewed as a task for the future is now a market reality, and countries are now realizing that they must act convincingly to not undermine economic progress. But even with all that said, in my opinion, the biggest challenge is that cybersecurity as a subject matter is just difficult. It has so many cross-cutting factors, stakeholders, and steps. When we have this like growing list of cliches, lexicons, technical standards, and what does this all mean in the local context, right? And this whole of society approach requirement usually means that investment in one aspect of cybersecurity doesn't really become fruitful before investing in all other aspects as well. So even deciding on how to mobilize resources for cybersecurity can be a challenge in itself. Not to mention, cybersecurity capacity building is very resource intensive. To this end, the World Bank and other global organizations provide economic and technical support for national cybersecurity capacity building so that developing countries do not have to tackle this challenge alone and can execute activities more effectively and efficiently. So I can speak for the World Bank, where we offer support from multiple fronts. So first, we develop knowledge products, including, let's say, for example, the Combating Cybercrime Toolkit for Emerging Economies. And we have also established partnerships with other international organizations and bodies to not only to prevent ourselves from duplicating efforts and to rather synthesize our varying specializations and eventually synergize, right? And moreover, the bank has recently established a dedicated cybersecurity trust fund supported by multiple donor countries to promote best practices and international standards. But most importantly, the bank makes most impact through our lending activities. We finance digital economy projects and ensure that cyber is part of the project design and often designated as a threshold issue. We support an array of activities from drafting laws and other legal documents, institutionalizing certs, public awareness campaigns, cultivating local industries, and developing local talent. So we take a holistic approach by not only working with other organizations, but also leveraging our convening power and global knowledge along with their experience in virtually all sectors. We work with the goal of achieving or helping countries achieve domestic cybersecurity independence, meaning technical, financial, and functional capacity to ensure sustainability, resilience, and self-sufficiency. So in all, despite the challenges facing developing countries, there is help, and the World Bank and other organizations stand ready to support everyone's cybersecurity efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. You touched on it a little bit already, but I just wanted to ask if you had anything else to add for this question. Can donors and implementers cooperation be beneficial in terms of products, services, and mechanisms to developing countries? You did mention it when you were discussing what the World Bank provides, but I just wanted to double check to see if there was anything else that you'd like to add on that front.
So yeah, as I said earlier, there are different organizations with different specializations, right? So they all have experience working their respective aspects of cybersecurity, but may not necessarily have all the resources or expertise to approach it in this whole of society approach, right? So approaching different organizations simultaneously while cooperating can help country develop this holistic cybersecurity framework.
Great, thank you. So we will then move on to Mr. Mamelo Thinyen. It really ties in nicely with both what Francisca and Kyung-Min have said, but it is reported that there are 3.5 million cybersecurity jobs available worldwide, and most managers state that their team is understaffed and that university graduates focusing on cybersecurity are not prepared for the real job challenges they will face. Also, many developing countries report that after trainings or educational programs, their best cybersecurity experts leave the country for better jobs. What activities or incentives could be included in a national cybersecurity strategy to stimulate the development of cybersecurity skills in a talented workforce? and to ensure the availability of these skills and professionals in the long term, and keeping them basically in the country that they are living and where they're being trained. For example.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Lucy. And yeah, that's a very great question. I think before we answer that question, I'd like to maybe just unpack a little bit what the skill gap is, because I believe there's different dimensions of the skill gap that if countries are to address it effectively, they need to have targeted interventions and approaches to the different elements of the gap. So normally we talk about this overall supply and demand shortfall. There isn't enough cybersecurity personnel around the world. That's a reality. Currently estimated at around 3.5 million, but we're seeing improvements in that. The work from IC Squared, they predict that between last year and this year, there's been an increase in the number of cybersecurity professionals. So I think at the first level, we could talk about this supply-demand gap, but I think there's also the competency and the skills mismatch, which you hinted at, right? The fact that a lot of industry, they mentioned the fact that graduates coming out of universities are not skilled adequately, they're not ready for jobs. So we can see this skills mismatch, both in terms of keeping up with the evolving cybersecurity risk landscape, as well as the evolving digital technology landscape in general. And I think for that, countries need to be thinking about how do we put in place some of the agile skills development frameworks and programs to be able to meet some of this evolving dynamic risk landscape. But I think if you think about the competency gap as well, this is something that's been mentioned earlier. Traditionally, we've always thought about cybersecurity in terms of the technical competencies and skills. And of course, this is because of the history of the domain. So from typical engineering, computer science backgrounds. But increasingly, I think we are realizing, of course, the multidisciplinary, multifaceted aspect of cybersecurity. And I think we need to be looking beyond just the traditional STEM disciplines in terms of fitting in the cybersecurity skills gap. So we should be looking at, for example, behavioral sciences and social sciences, looking at management skills, legal domains, and policy, diplomacy. All of these are elements that need to be considered when you think about cybersecurity capacity building. And so countries should be thinking about moving beyond just the STEM disciplines and STEM pipelines to encouraging all these other disciplines to contribute as well. The other gap that I want to talk about is the sectoral gap. So within countries, if you look at, for example, the private sector and sometimes the public sector, in general, you'll find that they are much more capacitated in terms of skills, in terms of resources than other sectors, than the SME sector, for example, or than the CBOs, NGO sectors. And I think countries also need to be thinking about how do we address that sectoral cybersecurity gaps in terms of upskilling civil society organizations and NGOs to be able to as well address their cybersecurity risk, because countries will realistically only be secure as much as the rest of the sectors are capacitated as well. The other gap I want to talk about is the participation and the diversity gap, right? This manifests in many ways, but one of the main ones is the participation of women within cybersecurity profession. Right now, the estimate is about 20 to 25% of cybersecurity professionals are women. That's still a big gap. I mean, there's a lot of effort that needs to be done in terms of encouraging more women to participate in cybersecurity. The same applies for marginalized population groups and minority population groups. I think there's opportunities to create diverse cybersecurity workforce that's able to provide solutions that are holistic and that are complete. And I think the last one is the one that you hinted at as well, is this idea of the geographic gaps as well. And I think this is captured quite well in the Global Cybersecurity Index, where you can see that least developed countries and some of the developing countries are facing a lot of challenges in terms of upscaling, in terms of building that capacity. And this is complex, of course. It's not a straight and easy challenge to fix. But one thing that we can look at, if we look at the African Union Migration Policy Framework for Africa, they identify this brain drain as a problem. And of course, some of the recommendations there are around countries creating gainful employment and career advancement opportunities for local staff. So I think countries need to be thinking not just about cybersecurity skills gap as a monolith, but thinking about what are some of these dimensions of the cybersecurity skills gap and how do we address each of those based on the specific context of the countries themselves. The good news is, as I said, there is advancements being made around increasing professionals around the world, but there's a lot of effort that needs to be done as well. And as far as countries are able to articulate interventions to address the different elements of the skills gap, I think that's what will allow us to be more effective. So thank you very much for that, and I'm looking forward to further discussions on this.
Thank you, everyone. I'm not sure if anybody has put any specific questions in the chat, but there were a couple comments made, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in there. We do have a little bit more time, but someone mentioned that tech cybersecurity competency is very important, and that's what they're looking at the International Bar Association, and they're looking at it for the global legal profession. So that's an interesting comment. Not sure if anybody else has any questions, or if I should go ahead and turn it over to the next panel. Just give it another minute. Just like to thank everyone, all of our panelists on this panel today, Francisca, Kyungmin, and Mamelo. Thank you so much for your time and interesting discussion. Carrie Ann Barrett from the cybersecurity policy, or is a cybersecurity policy specialist from the Organization of American States. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And as I asked my panels to turn their cameras on, this panel will focus around focus area number 7, which is international cooperation. As everyone knows, international cooperation is a key pillar to ensuring that cybersecurity is addressed holistically. The cyber criminals have no issue cooperating and making sure that they can collaborate on any initiatives, and they share information quite easily, especially when it comes to tools to be able to do anything malicious. So as Leslie said, my name is Carrie Ann Barrett. I've been the cybersecurity policy lead at the OAS for the past almost 7 years. And I think we're gonna probably kick off this panel with the poll. So Kathleen, if you're able to launch the poll, it'll be for 30 seconds. While the poll is being launched, I wanted to just introduce my panelists. One of our speakers is Georgie Jacques, who currently works as the Cybercrime Program Office at the Council of Europe, where he's in charge of regional projects covering the Eastern Partnership region, addressing issues of cybercrime and electronic evidence. We have Ms. Akvil Janiotiene, who is the head of Cyber and New Technologies Unit at the UNCTC. In her tenure, she substantively supports member states, international and regional organizations, and UN entities in raising awareness on terrorist and cyber threat. We also have with us Kadri Kaska, who is the head of the CCDOE Law Branch and previously worked in cybersecurity policy and research at the CCDOE, and mainly focuses on national cybersecurity strategy and governance. And last but not least, we have Andres Kastelik, who is a cyber stability researcher, part of the security and technology program. Prior to joining UNIDIR, Andres held various research positions in different international organizations. With that said, Kathleen has now shared with us the poll results, which is still coming in. But in relation to the question, what are the main challenges countries are facing in establishing and enforcing a comprehensive legal framework to combat cybercrime, a majority of our respondents said it's the lack of harmonized cybercrime legal and regulatory frameworks. In your opinion, what aspect of cybersecurity international cooperation should be prioritized? A majority of you identified that enhancing information sharing practices is one of the major challenges, should be prioritized. And the second one is defining international standards for adoption. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for that. As we kick into this, it's important to set the context for our panel. As I said, it's on international cooperation. And Georgie, we wanted to kickstart the panel with you. Strategies should be promoted and the development of domestic legal frameworks to protect society from cyber harm. One of the things that we need to look at is how can this be extended to facilitate international cooperation? What do you see are the key elements that a legal frameworks for cybersecurity, I guess, should include? And what resources do you think a government needs or countries need to be able to develop and update their legal framework? Georgie, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Kerry-Ann. And before I start, first of all, many words of thanks to both organizers of this call, but also to the organizers of the whole process of development of NCS Guide to have us on board. I think we as a Council of Europe also learned a lesson or two when it comes to the development of such sort of compromise documents by taking on board different ideas and different approaches. But in the end, of course, it was definitely worth the effort. And responding to your question about the development of domestic legal framework and what kind of elements should it consist of, specifically on the matters of cybersecurity, I guess that, again, I think looking at the guide will be the easiest answer, of course, but I'll provide a more extended one, which is, I think, it's also captured in the guide, at least in the introduction to the Focus Area 6, which deals with regulation and legislation as such, by focusing on what is minimum required, at least, to have in terms of regulation in there. And I think that when it comes to the minimum, it's very important to set out the scope. And I think the main idea just built in there is that interplay between the fields of cybercrime, between the fields of cybersecurity and data protection is the one that is going to actually guide the work of the national authorities when they deal with regulations in this particular area. So when it comes to the minimum, which is required for adoption of legislation that defines cybersecurity norms and regulations, we believe that what constitutes illegal cyber activity should be defined either by the criminal law or by the different definitions in different acts. So this is, the criminal law is not a response to everything, and criminal justice is just one of the means to respond to the threats of cyberspace. So regulation should probably reflect that one as well. But of course, the key here is that the framework is sufficiently enabling for national authorities or for other authorities, actually, or organizations responsible for cybersecurity or cybercrime to be able to cooperate at national level between themselves and beyond borders. So the powers given to them by this legislation should not simply, just go into definition of facts, but also provide them the powers to do something, to do deterrence, investigation, prosecution, and all the other activities that are geared towards the prevention of security threats. The establishment of compliance mechanisms is the second element that was dealt as a minimum, I would say, for regulation. So this extends both also to cybersecurity, but also to information security standards and domains. So it's very important to take compliance mechanisms on board and have them provided in a clear manner in the law. Or in regulations, so because again, the acts of parliament are sometimes not the venue to address everything that is required for regulation. The capacity building, quite surprisingly, is also an agreement between the working group, which needs to be there. So it's important not just to have the laws in place, but also the powers and the capacities to implement them. So if it is possible to provide regulation also for the different units, organizations, or authorities dealing with matters of cybersecurity, that would be, of course, one of the priorities for regulation as well. The last two elements, not surprisingly, touch upon the institutionalization of the critical sectors, of the critical entities, or sectors of economy, if we talk about it in general, or critical infrastructure, if we say it in other terms. Sometimes this is a backbone, recognized backbone for start of regulations. So because governments and authorities do not have enough resources to cover everything, especially if they're in the beginning of their journey, they would prefer to focus on what matters most. And the concept of critical infrastructure, essential services, and also provide regulations to them in terms of like obligatory regulations being applicable is the way to start. And last but not least, the international cooperation, which includes both formal but also informal mechanisms of cooperation. Informal mechanisms of cooperation, for example, in the area of cybersecurity, are sometimes working even more efficiently and the formal ones due to difficulties with the subject matter. But this is again the minimum, and when it comes to maximum, of course, the sky is the limit. But I think the limit there is also a very important subject matter of safeguards and guarantees. So the human rights safeguards and human rights in general, because those are naturally limiting concepts to regulation, and especially to intrusion into the privacy of individuals, the rule of law, and the other aspects that are necessary to balance with cybersecurity threats and investigation into this. So this is it from my side.
So I wanted to have a quick follow-up, Georgie, because when a country goes through all of that to ensure that they have this legal framework, at the end of the day, they're not an island. Cybercrime goes through every single border. And do you see any benefit to be gained by promoting harmonized legal frameworks aligned with international standards across countries, recognizing that there's so many different jurisdictions? You have common law, you have more civil law, and then you have other things in the Middle East in terms of how their legal frameworks are set up. Do you see any benefits to promote harmonized legal frameworks?
Yes, thank you. And I think the answer to this question is fairly easy. It's a resounding yes. And I think it is also supported by the results of a poll that was just run before the session, because the majority sided with the need for harmonization as being one of the prevalent priorities when it comes to regulation. So harmonization is sometimes the key through which the international standards and instruments are going to work for individual countries. And again, I think it's very important to set out why harmonization is important here now, just for two really just reasons. I mean, there are many reasons, but two probably the key ones. So beyond simply having your laws in order and compliant with international obligations, it's very important to have the tools that enable you to do domestic investigations or domestic action on cybercrime and cybersecurity threats. So the laws are not simply there to be harmonized between the states, but to ensure that it's the most effective and most sort of common response to cyber threats, which brings us to the next point, because the majority of cybercrime and cybersecurity incidents these days are international in nature. And when you need to cooperate internationally, for example, exchange evidence, then harmonized rules are going to go a very long way in terms of securing admissible evidence that you can exchange with the counterparts. So yes, that's a very short answer to a very complex question. But
and we appreciate the perspective, because it leads us straight into our next speaker, which is Akbil. One of the things that persons have said is they call it effective policing in cyberspace. And one of the things, it's a term I'll probably use carefully as it's stated here for us, but how do you think we should really monitor and see what the challenges are in regulated cyberspace? Should it be driven by information, as an example? When there's an emergent cyber threat or a new type of cybercrime identified, and information has to be shared almost quickly between law enforcement, how can countries develop effective information sharing mechanisms to ensure timely, relevant, and more importantly, actionable information is accurately shared? And I want to just throw in there's so many actors involved in this. There's CERTs, there's national cybersecurity agencies, there's SOCs, law enforcement, private sectors. There's a multitude of actors happening. Do you have any insight on this that you could share with us?
Thank you, Carrie Ann, and good morning from New York. And let me say that it's a real pleasure to participate in today's launch of the revised guide for development of a national cybersecurity strategy. Let me start by telling a little bit what we do. So at the United Nations Counterterrorism Center, we look at cybersecurity from a threat actor perspective, which is a unique way to look at it. We're looking at what are the major threats stemming from terrorist actors in cyberspace, what needs to be done at national, regional, and international levels to make sure that terrorists are denied using digital space for their nefarious purposes, and which they do. They use the internet and social media to spread violent extremist ideologies, radicalize people, incite and plan terrorist attacks. They use virtual assets for terrorist financing, and they use cryptography and the dark web to hide. The use of computer network devices by terrorist actors to sabotage critical national infrastructures such as energy, transportation systems, water, government facilities, healthcare, or communications is of an increasing concern to member states. And several terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda and Daesh, have expressed intent to build offensive cyber capabilities that would allow them to carry out potentially devastating attacks from afar. And the Global Program on Cybersecurity and New Technologies which I have a privilege to lead, support member states in building capacities to prevent, respond, and mitigate to these very specific cyber threats stemming from terrorist actors. National cybersecurity strategies that we are gathered here to discuss today define a strategic and holistic national approach to cybersecurity. This revised guide established seven overarching themes to help steer national cybersecurity strategy development efforts, such as governance, risk management, preparedness and resilience to cyber incidents, critical infrastructure and essential services, capacity building and awareness raising, legislation and regulation, and international cooperation. Looking from a threat actor perspective, one of the most important elements that national cybersecurity strategies need to address is law enforcement capacity building and establishment of interagencies processes. Why? Because to deny criminals and terrorists abusing digital space, it is not sufficient to secure the networks, as the bad guys will find new vulnerabilities and continue to become smarter. It is also very important to reduce the number of threat actors by prosecuting them for criminal acts, be it cybercrime or terrorism. The revised guide states that the National Cybersecurity Strategy should encourage the development of cyber law enforcement capacity, including training and education for a range of stakeholders involved in combating cybercrime, like judges, prosecutors, lawyers, law enforcement officials, forensic specialists, financial investigators, and others. The guide further elaborates that law enforcement should receive specialized training to interpret and apply domestic cybercrime laws to effectively detect, deter, investigate, and prosecute cybercrime offenses while respecting human rights, and to effectively collaborate with industry, as you mentioned, and international law enforcement entities like Interpol, Europol, to tackle cybercrime and to boost cybersecurity. So it just shows how many actors are involved in addressing threats. The guide also states that the strategy should identify and recognize the mandates of domestic agencies to ensure compliance with cybercrime legislations, which typically fall under criminal justice system, and those responsible for prevention and response to cyber incidents that raise to the national level and include protection of critical information infrastructures, which typically falls under the incident response part or CSIRT part. The guide does not provide a prescriptive guidance to member states on how those mandates should be distributed and how interagency cooperation between law enforcement and national CSIRTs should work, as each country decides what best works for them in terms of governance, legislation, and information sharing. But there are several things to consider when using national cybersecurity strategy to build law enforcement capacity and establish interagency processes. First, I think it's important to understand that both national CSIRTs and law enforcement play a role in deterring attacks. National CSIRTs do it through protection and hardening of the systems, as it increases the cost for the attacker. Law enforcement agencies, on the other hand, play a role in deterring attacks through prosecution of culprits. More attacks can be deterred if law enforcement have the ability, willingness, and knowledge to constantly prosecute the perpetrators of cyber attacks. Second, even though the law enforcement and CSIRT mandates differ, their tasks related to cyber incidents and cybercrime can often be similar. For example, both CSIRT and law enforcement may collect cyber threat information, classify cyber incidents and cyber crimes, collect evidence, and assess incident damage or costs. With the overlapping duties, there's a risk of lack of coordination at national level. This in turn might lead to interference into each other's activities and negative impact. So it is essential that CSIRTs and law enforcement community agree on rules for segregation of duties to prevent these negative effects. And last, and I'm already finishing, but not least, despite the difference in approaches to cybersecurity, cooperation between the law enforcement agencies and national CSIRTs is very important to respond to cyber attacks, as it leads to improved availability of information at the national level, which in turn leads to better information sharing regionally or internationally, increased ability to respond to cyber attacks, greater availability of expertise in the country, and overall greater security for the society. To finish, the focus area 6 of the revised guide covers these elements for member states to consider while developing or revising their national cybersecurity strategies. And
Thank you so much for that, Akbil. But I wanted to just ask you, can you just give us 2 points in how can countries, with all that you've described in terms of the importance of this information sharing, can you give me your 2 top tips in how they can create or foster this information sharing at the national level? Do you have any tips? Just 2 tips.
Just of two most important tips, I would say. First is to define clear roles and responsibilities at legislative or regulation or policy level, so it is clear who is doing what. And then I believe exercises is the most relevant thing to apply, to train the procedures, to train the processes, how information can be shared nationally, regionally, to identify the gaps, what needs to be improved, probably also at the regulatory level, and just bring those 2 communities together to work and avoid any misunderstandings that might happen.
Thank you so much, because it leads us to Kadri. When you speak of that level of communication and the need to have meaningful engagement in discussion, cooperation, negotiation, cyber diplomacy, all of those efforts at the regional and international level requires first, I think, a baseline in the country actually thinking about how they foster information sharing at the national level, which Akbil has just pointed out to us. So if we go to the macro level, could you provide a general overview of the main fora and international mechanisms that countries can actually join to effectively engage in international cyber-related issues? What are some of the benefits that these countries could see in actually participating in these discussions? Kadri, over to you.
Thank you, Carrie-Anne, and thanks for your kind introduction. And good afternoon and greetings from Tallinn, where it's appropriately for the Nordic zones turning rather dark already. So it's obviously a challenge of a question in itself, much like nations' readiness to approach cybersecurity strategically and also systemically has matured since even the publication of the first guide to developing the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which was just 3 years ago. The various formats for international engagement have multiplied as well, and that applies across all sectors and all actors with any stakes in the cyber business. So be it governments, be it industry, civil society, NGOs, and really any combinations thereof. So you have the formats, on the one hand, directly driven by digital and cyber topics, but you also have broader ones that have embraced online and cybersecurity issues next to their traditional offline scope, such as you have the Regional or Topical Cooperations Organization in the European Union or the Organization of American States, which you know rather well, or Interpol, for example. And such kind of a mainstreaming is obviously a very welcome development as societies become increasingly digitalized. There is a growing digital dimension, so the mainstreaming of cybersecurity into those actions is only normal and only welcome. Then you have the fora on various levels, each obviously with its own mandate and again dynamic. On the strategic level, you have those shaping the interstate, the normative environment, such as the UN group of governmental experts or the open-ended working group format addressing the cyber norms, rules, and principles for responsible state behavior, which in the inclusiveness of the new open-ended working group format have been actually given a very positive outcome and now continuing in December. And obviously the road didn't end with formulating a consensus on the objectives and norms. There's now the task to also deliver on it by committing to concrete action, implementing the norms to reduce risks, whether the joint mechanism like the proposed UN program of action for advancing responsible state behavior can be very beneficial for both amplifying individual efforts by concrete actions and by supporting capacity building. So in addition to the strategic level, you have the operational and technical level cooperation formats, international and regional police cooperation via Interpol, Europol, incident management cooperation in the first and the TFC cert networks. Then you have the intergovernmental formats the UN Security Council discussion on cybersecurity earlier this year. And then you have the multi-stakeholder, such as the Global Forum of Cyber Expertise. There's fora that form around topics like diplomacy, law enforcement, international trade, human rights, incident response, so that really the whole range. So whoever said that cybersecurity just means the security of interconnected ICT, but the problem is that in today's world, that means the security of everything, that international collaboration formats also mean pretty much collaboration on everything in every thinkable format. And that I didn't even mention, and that will not come to the regional organizations or even bilateral cooperation formats, which can and are both highly productive and valuable. So it can indeed be challenging for a nation and to keep track of the various fora. And the guide with its reference material does point out several of the key fora and tools available. But in the end, I think the mapping exercise and prioritization for each country is up to the individual nation to tailor to their situation and their needs. And then you asked about the benefits, and there's several of those as well. I mean, obviously a key benefit in engaging in such processes is to give your nation and your national stakeholders, including civil society and the businesses, a voice in the way our common digital environment is shaped. So that's pretty obvious. But I've seen also that participation itself has had benefits by catalyzing the formulation of national objectives, national values, positions within the participating country and among its various government players and industry and civil society partners. And then also and that's sort of my concluding point here, is that there is benefit of engaging with international and regional formats as a unique form of international community building, a mechanism of facilitating communication, creating trust, creating predictability. So that's sort of, you get it almost as a byproduct of the actual engagement, but that's definitely one that is has high and lasting value by itself.
Thank you so much, Kadri. Because I mean, you spoke about the need for nations to map, and I think if they had a cheat sheet, which you just outlined, would be a great baseline to start with. That sounds like an excellent cheat sheet. So now that they've mapped, I think one last question I just have for you, which is, I think it's a quick one. Can you give us 3 key messages you could say to states in terms of how they could meaningfully then prepare to engage? They've done their mapping. What are some of can you give me 3 key things they should consider for prepping for engagement?
What the guide actually highlights and provides guidance on is the aligning of the nation's domestic policy and its international agenda, so that the activities of, say, industry and trade or security and justice are informed by each other's activities and shaped by each other and obviously coordinated with each other, so that national challenges are approached internationally as a consistent whole. And that also what I've seen actually as a persistent challenge, regardless of the size of the or the cybersecurity maturity of a particular country, is that even in the international engagements, work is happening on silos. So that kind of a challenge for consolidating and coordinating the needs, the priorities, the capacities of those individual actors is something that doesn't only apply to nations that are new to the cybersecurity strategy process, but also experienced veterans. Then secondly, especially for small countries, which, sorry to say, but means most of us, or maybe happy to say, the drive to stretch beyond our capacity is always there. And the engagements, therefore, have to be very consciously, very strategically defined, both in terms of what engagements and how we engage in them. So a conscious effort to do domestic policy and foreign policy dialogue is key to ensuring that we don't spread ourselves too thin, that our national objectives are actually pursued effectively. And finally, the issue of capacity building, I think, is also something that is important for both the recipient country and the donor country to engage in as they feed. I mean, obviously, they feed the objectives for which participation and engagement in capacity building is meant for. But it's also like training and mainstreaming that cybersecurity thinking and the objectives into a far broader forum than simply the individual parties engaging in it directly. So it's like the capacity building itself has value for the recipients as well as for the donors.
Thank you so much, Karja, because that leads us into the capable hands of Andres, who's going to take our panel home. Because with all that the other speakers have said, Andres, and recognizing the increasing role that so many aspects, even as Karja has pointed out, human rights, economic development, all the different topics that nations have to think about, what capability, including skills and organizational structure, do you think states should develop in order to complement the traditional methods and process of diplomacy to engage successfully in these discussions? Andres, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Karen. And thanks to the ITU for involving Unilever in this process. I think to facilitate this international cooperation in all these areas, even though I will be slightly more biased towards diplomacy in general, but nonetheless, I think states should ideally have a dedicated cybersecurity department within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or any sort of outside-looking department of the government, which is to coordinate national actors at home and abroad to take sort of a unified approach in concert to the cybersecurity international relations. I think Kadri already mentioned before that the guide also emphasizes the need for the connect between domestic policies and international engagement when it comes to cybersecurity. And I think this is only possible if there's one particular department, one single entity within the government that is only focused on international cooperation when it comes to cybersecurity. I think someone Aquila I think as well mentioned the need for clear roles and responsibilities, and that goes in that direction as well. And I think in order to operationalize the foreign engagement in cybersecurity matters, states should invest in capacity building of their domestic networks around the world, as well as at home. So I think that means educating the network about the international negotiations, processes that were mentioned today a couple of times, so past GGE, but current OEWG and potential POA, or anything else that is related to international ICT, peace and security. So I think a question was related to the third committee issues and cybercrime, excuse me, cybercrime as well. So I think this is quite important, but also the diplomatic staff or any stakeholders engaged in this activity from home or abroad should be educated, or let's say educated about bilateral relations also. So it's not only about multilateral aspect of international cooperation when it comes to cybersecurity, but also bilateral relations that states have established with specific states around the world. And I think they should through that network they should pursue domestic priorities of foreign policy also abroad. And I know that I saw the poll said the results said that very few people think that international norms or development of international norms is important today. But I think states should focus on implementing these particular norms, and in order to do so, I think the guide also recognizes that. I think that's not contentious submission, but nonetheless, I think to operationalize these norms or implement, and talking again here from the international cooperation standpoint, so it should really invest in capacities related to the implementation. So it all starts probably with the promotion of the existing norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And when I say about promotion, it's domestically, and promotion shouldn't really be focused on diplomatic community, on policy making community, but broader. I think private sector is equally important in this regard. Some states have made actually significant efforts to explain the norms and their necessity to the domestic stakeholders, and through that probably ensuring the buy-in of the whole cybersecurity community, not just the state apparatus. I think that is quite important, and I'm of the opinion that states should perhaps follow, other states should perhaps follow this example, and also share good practices with the rest of the world, because that's how the capacity gets built as well.
And I think it's important, Andres, as you mentioned, the need to have that multi-stakeholder involvement. Could you identify, because this is cyber diplomacy, do you think there are some key public and private sector stakeholders that should be involved?
Sure, yeah. I think we keep on saying the cybersecurity area is sort of unique and requires the engagement of multi-stakeholder communities, but I'm not really sure this is that cybersecurity is so unique. But nonetheless, on the surface, yes, as you mentioned, or as you alluded, and I mentioned, on the surface, the answer is very simple. It was also emphasized by the NCS guide, right, that we are, or the states should aim for inclusive multi-stakeholder approach to cybersecurity. And I think that is indeed imperative. This goes for international cooperation as well, not only when it comes to cybersecurity domestically. For example, the law and policymaking community is the obvious community that should be involved, but also law enforcement, diplomatic community, I mentioned it a couple of times, intelligence and defense community, and obviously non-state actors such as industry partners. These are just some of the stakeholder groups that states could consider in the context of international cooperation related to cybersecurity. But it's not. I think we were also very clear in a guide. After I mentioned that today, that well, actually that occurred already in the first edition of the NCS guide. That states should really follow the comprehensive approach, tailored priorities principle. I think, or tailored priorities. I'm not sure how we framed it, which essentially, in line with this, means that I or none of the partners probably is in a position to offer any prescriptive list of these stakeholders that should be involved. The composition will probably be slightly different for every state and then their individual circumstances, and that's okay as long as it allows the states to meaningfully engage with the international community when it comes to cybersecurity issues. Perhaps on a more substantial level, and to give a good example why this is in fact needed. Guide says, as I mentioned, that states should really probably commit to the implementation of the agreed norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And for example, one of the norms, there are two, but one is it's better for this example, speaks about a critical infrastructure, saying the state should essentially take appropriate measures to protect their critical infrastructure from ICT threats. Now, given the critical infrastructure in many countries is operated, sometimes even owned by private sector entities, I can't really see how a state can implement the norm without the intimate involvement of the private sector. So that's how I'm not too long.
No, that was perfect. And I wanted to thank each of my panelists, because I think we've gotten, just all of us participating in this process demonstrates that focus area 7 of true international cooperation, thinking about cybercrime, cybersecurity, what's needed nationally, how to map, and how to actually meaningfully prepare for engaging on the international fora to discuss these issues and how it impacts states. It's critical. So thanks so much to everyone. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but I'm seeing that the chat was pretty engaged, and George, you went ahead and answered some of the questions directly. So I'm really happy for that. Without much ado, Marco, we'll hand the floor back over to you. And thanks again, my panelists. You guys are excellent. Marco, over to you.
Yes, I'm here. You can hear me, yes? Well, sometimes I switch, okay. Thanks, Thanks, Karianne. Thanks, everyone. I think with that, we actually conclude this session. And I hope that has been insightful, at least from my perspective, or I learned a lot, even more, you know, following the discussion, even if I'm in the field for since few years now. But again, there's always more to learn on sharing, you know, our common experiences. I think we are a little bit short in time, but it seems that we were really good in managing, you know, there's a lot allocated to us. So if there are no other, let's say, possible interaction, either from the floor or from, let's say, from the participant, from the chat, I see the moderators has taken, I mean, has done a very good job in taking into account all the different comments that were coming from the audience, generally speaking. So with that, I think we can actually close the session and give you back a few minutes of your time. Before doing that, however, I just wanted to maybe spend a word of thanks to Microsoft, which actually helped us a lot with the graphical part, with the formatting part, with the look and feel, and also with the website. Without, of course, you know, not thanking everyone in the group. And I tell you, for the ones that didn't participate into the interaction and the discussion, we were a pretty big group. Again, 20 organizations, sometimes represented by 2-3 people, and we had our up and down in terms of you know, discussing and finding, you know, the right solution by consensus. But I think that we had been really good in converging toward, you know, what is now basically the second version of the guide. So from my side, I really want to thank you, and personally thank you everyone that contributed to the work, and of course, I mean, according to their own capacity, according to their own availability and capability. So with that, again, thanks everyone really for the terrific job. So now the guide is online, is available to everyone that want to use it. Again, is not something, and I want to really reiterate that, is not something that is owned by the ITU or by any other organization. Is really a completely, let's say, co-developed work, and this is actually reflected into the preamble of the document. Of course, ITU is kind of keeping a little bit the administrative component of that. So in case, you know, there would be requests to share piece of the content, but of course, then, you know, there is an element there that is explaining how a specific quote that is taken from the guide has to be endorsed by all the different organizations. So ITU is taking a little bit this kind of administrative responsibility, but for the rest, the guide is, and it will be, a completely co-authored and co-created piece of work. And in that sense, also, it is important to emphasize the fact that we want to use the guide collectively. And of course, I mean, as we did for the first version, I mean, we are using that as really a toolkit to help countries in their journey. And I'm seeing everyone is thanking for the session, and I thank you back for your time to everyone. So with that, and without any further ado, I don't know, Oran or Giacomo, if you want to add anything from the ITU side, since you were the one really leading from the ITU perspective. Otherwise, we can just go ahead and basically close this fantastic webinar. And yeah. Happy Thanksgiving to all the Americans also. We don't celebrate that in Europe, but I understand in US it's a big celebration, so that's good. Melissa, thanks for reminding that. And all right, so let's go ahead. Let's close this, and thanks a lot to everyone again. And then I hope we will keep in touch and stay tuned to any other possible updates. Oran, something else to add? Otherwise we go. Okay, perfect. Thank you. And again, thanks everybody, and have a nice day, have a nice week, have a nice continuation. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Don't worry. Apologies if I seem distracted, trying to do 10 things at once.
I guess, Kathleen, you can end the session. Thank you very much.